You are listening to the War on the Rocks podcast on strategy, defense, and foreign affairs. My name is Ryan Evans. I'm the founder of War on the Rocks. In this episode, we dive into a major development at the intersection of tech, trade, and national security. You may have read that the United States has just given the green light for Nvidia's H20 chips, originally restricted under export controls, to be sold to China. Here to break down why this matters so much for national security are two guests. Liza Tobin is managing director at Garnaut Global, a geopolitical risk advisory firm. She also served on the first Trump administration's National Security Council staff and is a CIA veteran and a top China expert. We also have Brad Carson. Brad's a former member of Congress, a former senior defense official. Until recently, he was the president of Tulsa University, and he's now the head of Americans for Responsible Innovation. You may also remember Brad because he hosted a great show for us years ago called Jaw Jaw. Enjoy the conversation. How did you get into focusing on AI and the hardware of AI?
So I got into AI through the Defense Department because when I was Undersecretary of the Army, we oversaw all of the legal issues confronting the department when it came to the law of war. And so the Army lawyers were often in Geneva, usually negotiating about detainee policy, what constitutes torture or not. But toward the end of my time there in the Obama administration, AI and autonomous weapons became a big issue. And the department became a bit seized of it as well. And so I got involved early on there a bit. And then when I became a professor at the University of Virginia during the Trump administration, I happened to get invited to this great conference in Puerto Rico, a very famous conference now, where a lot of leading AI people were there, and got to know them well. And so I've been following the issue closely really since my time at DOD and over the last few years as it's become a big public policy issue even more.
Is this in Puerto Rico every year?
No, it's hit or miss.
All right.
So
I was going to ask for an invite if it's in Puerto Rico every year. Hook me up. And Liza, how about you?
I got into it through a career focused on China and national security. So 15 years in the government, CIA, US Indo-PACOM, and then the White House. I started off my career focused on China as a young person, right out of school, spending time working there, studying there. And that was really in the heyday of really positive U.S.-China relations. And so
responsible stakeholder era?
Responsible, even going back before that, I'm not going to reveal my age. But so my career has sort of traced that sad decline and the kind of downward spiral of U.S.-China relations. And then after my time in government, I spent 3 years working for Eric Schmidt at something called the Special Competitive Studies Project. And that was focused on how do we win the competition in AI with China. So right now, my career is focused on this pivotal crossover between the two big issues facing our country, I think, competition with China and then the rise of AI.
Brad, the organization that you lead now, first tell us a bit about it and tell us about this new initiative that you folks put out that is really the core of the issue that we're here to talk about today.
So I lead Americans for Responsible Innovation, ARI, it's called here. It's based in Washington, D.C., and we advocate for reasonable guardrails around AI. So a lot of our work is focused on domestic policy, about transparency in the frontier labs, about evaluations and making sure that the labs aren't releasing models that could create bioweapons or be used to help terrorists or be misaligned in some way that could threaten, even have civilizational consequences. So that's really what we do. But export controls are a key part of that too, because we believe that while there should be reasonable guardrails around AI, it is important for the U.S. to lead in this space. It's a transformative technology, and that leadership over China is critical, and export controls play a very important part of that. And so the last couple of weeks, we've been active in trying to resist what is a change in the Trump administration policy of allowing this chip called the H20, which is designed for inference, which is a part of the AI world, to be exported to China.
Is this like the top chip? I mean, walk us through what's special about this chip.
So it's not the top chip. So the top chip is the H100, soon to be the B100. That's what is most coveted, in which there's a lot of smuggling going on into China. Export controls today prohibit the sale by Nvidia of that particular chip to China. The H20 was designed by Nvidia to get around the export controls, but then were brought within the export controls early on in the Trump administration. And they said we shouldn't really sell them. It was an open question whether the H20 was going to be sold to China or not. And it's designed for so-called inference. And inference is that part of AI where, say you ask it a question, like just as a consumer, when it's giving you an answer, that's the inference stage of AI. It's now part of the larger training aspect too. Inference plays a bigger role in the training of the models. And so as AI has changed itself and how these models are being built, inference and the chips designed for inference have played a much bigger role in it. And so for people who care about AI, making sure that the US stays in the lead, we don't want China to have the best chip in the world for inference, so that particular aspect of it. And so that's really what the H20 is. It's an inference chip. And the Trump administration kind of did an about face in the last couple of weeks, saying that they were going to permit Nvidia to sell it to China.
Liza, zooming out a bit, to what extent does China depend on Western and American chips in particular at this level, these more advanced chips?
Well, your listeners will remember back in January when Wall Street and Silicon Valley were shocked by the breakout of DeepSeek and their R1 model. And we know now that DeepSeek was able to make some of those advances in inference, partly based on having access to this H20 chip, which Jensen Huang of Nvidia had designed for the China market, as Brad laid out. And so this new company, this startup that has since become a behemoth, this model burst onto the scene and really shocked people. And that was because of the advances in inference. So the US still has advantages in AI training, training these foundational large language models in the big companies. But this showed that there were other ways to innovate in AI, and part of it was based on these H20 chips. So that was right at the beginning of the Trump administration, and it caused this kind of churn within the US policy establishment. What do we do about this? And then a couple months later, you saw the Commerce Department put the export controls on the H20 and say China can't have these anymore. And then just a couple weeks ago in mid-July, after Jensen Huang got in and spoke with the president in the Oval Office and had kind of been developing relationships around Washington, he was able to persuade them to basically move back and kind of take a step back and reverse that policy, which essentially brings the U.S. export control regime, rewinds the clock in kind of 3 years, all the way back to the Biden administration, which had sort of pushed the ball forward with this major decision that people refer to as the Sullivan Doctrine back in 2022, when the National Security Council then realized that it's not enough to have what's called a sliding scale approach, which is to try to just kind of keep a couple steps ahead, maybe a couple node sizes or whatever metric you want to use. But in principle, we need to do everything we can to maintain as large a lead as possible, basically do anything we can to buy ourselves time in this AI race. So by basically kind of putting the controls on and then taking them off again, essentially the Trump administration was just kind of slipping back into that pre-Biden era. So strategically, it kind of is just basically letting the Chinese buy time and giving them the runway to kind of take off and make a lot of progress that otherwise the U.S. could have used.
And you worked in the first Trump administration, and the first Trump administration actually made a lot of progress in stopping, for example, advanced chip manufacturing equipment being exported to China. Did you work on these issues in particular?
Yeah, that's right, Ryan. So that's why it's so surprising and honestly disappointing to see the second Trump administration kind of fall back on the policies and kind of, U.S. policymakers, when it comes to China, for some reason, they're just struck by some combination of amnesia and hubris. Amnesia is just forgetting these lessons, these hard-fought lessons that eventually in the first Trump administration, his staff, myself included, were able to persuade him that this was a step we needed to take in order to hold Huawei back. It wasn't enough to, completely defeat Huawei, but it would be unrealistic to expect export controls alone to be the strategy that we use to win in AI. But it's something that can kind of put a speed bump in China's path, and that's what it did. It bought us some time. And so by now kind of going back and reneging on that decision, essentially they're forgetting about all the lessons we learned, and for some combination of catering to industry and then falling prey to what I think is a very seductive but ultimately empty argument.
Part of me wonders how much these export controls even matter. And I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit here. But one of the ways that Nvidia has been able to adapt to them is they're just like, all right, well, there's export controls on this chip. We'll just design one that's very, very similar and call it something new and start exporting it to China again. So what is the actual meaning of these export controls and how effective are they even?
Well, I think they have been effective, and it's not my take. It's what the Chinese themselves say. The people who run DeepSeek that Liza talked about, the other Chinese leaders in AI, will tell you they'd be farther ahead still if they had access to American chips. that these top shelf chips are a big constraint on them. So yes, there's smuggling. There's a lot of workarounds that Nvidia tries to do. The Chinese are developing their own indigenous capabilities. But the top shelf chips from America, from Nvidia, are still the coin of the realm, and their lack of access to them at scale is definitely holding them back.
Well, but Nvidia, of course, argues that the key to holding China back is to keep them dependent on American technology. What do you two say to that?
Yeah, it's a seductive argument, right? It sounds appealing, intellectually appealing, but ultimately it's specious. People have been making this argument about China before, but any student of history knows that China's self-reliance drive goes all the way back to the 1950s. I mean, they've been trying to make indigenous semiconductors since the 1950s. The 1956 was when they made their first transistor. So they have been dead set on tech reliance. And it's just that in the last few years, we've all been having wake-up call after wake-up call that they're now experiencing a lot of the results from that. So the idea that we can keep China addicted to our tech and that they're going to happily just keep buying American technology and never shifting towards self-reliance just ignores 70 years of history.
Nvidia, of course, would say this is also very unfair to them as a company, as you're stopping them from making money. I've heard that Jensen will call senior officials wailing and saying that you're killing my company. This is ridiculous.
I mean, it has a $4 trillion market cap today. Half of the employees are millionaires. They're oversubscribed in their sales of chips. And so I don't think the Chinese market is one that's causing them much financial pain right now. They've said in the past it might cost them, currently sales are like $17 billion a year to China for other types of permissible chips. They say it's cost them billions. It seems like they're doing just fine. And there's a national security imperative here, right? We can't just be selling the rope to people who want to hang us. It doesn't really make sense, as Liza explained.
Yeah, and just to add to that, to pull out your point about the demand for NVIDIA chips, they're not able to make enough to meet the market demand. And so what you see now is that if they go to TSMC and TSMC is fabbing the H20s for the China market, that's less space to fab chips for the US hyperscalers and other US companies.
So then why does he even want to do it? If what you say is correct, is that they're oversubscribed, so then this shouldn't even matter to Nvidia in a way. So why is it so important to them?
I think two things are important. One is they have made H20s and they're going to have to write some of them off. That is a cost to them in some way, trivial in the scope of a huge business like they are. So they do want to kind of liquidate their H20 stock. But I think it goes back to what Liza said and you suggested, where there is a debate ongoing about should you be selling to China to keep their indigenous capabilities down? We know they're furiously trying to develop their own kind of semiconductors. And the NVIDIA moat is not just the semiconductor itself, the hardware. They have a whole ecosystem driven by software, libraries. Huawei in their 910C chip, the 920 chip they're developing, is trying to compete on the hardware. And they also have alternatives to this software package. And so I think if you're going to steel man the NVIDIA argument, it'd be like, look, we don't want them to get any headway at all in developing an alternative kind of semiconductor ecosystem to what NVIDIA does. Because Liza said, that's probably going to happen anyway, right? They're going to do their best to get there. There's nothing that NVIDIA is going to do that's going to keep Xi Jinping to say, oh, we're okay. He's still being like reliant on the NVIDIA stack. They're going to work it. Huawei is going to try to do it.
And we saw them do this with other American technologies as well, is that they just sort of use, abuse, and steal IP and then start creating it themselves. It's sort of inevitable in a way.
And this is the most important product in the world today. And so certainly they're not fools to say, yeah, it's fine if NVIDIA simply makes it. They would love to have an alternative. And so my own view is that they're going to keep that project up rapidly and do as fast as they can to develop an alternative to NVIDIA, whether or not we sell to them. And I think it is very hard. The project is difficult. You can't just recreate what the semiconductor supply chain that NVIDIA uses is. And so I think there's a great chance that America could maintain a decades-long lead in these kind of semiconductor manufacturing equipment that would give us, a 3 to 5 year lead in chips that could be maintained for a very long time.
I want to take a quick break to highlight a clip from a really exciting episode of our newest show, Cogs of War, which is free for everyone. This isn't a members-only show. You can listen to this whenever you want on your podcast app of choice. Cogs of War is sponsored by our friends at Booz Allen Hamilton, and this episode features a conversation with Joe Musselman. He is the founder of BVVC. He also started a great organization called the Honor Foundation, which transitions special operators into the civilian world. And we spoke about Union, a really exciting munitions factory startup that he helped put together.
Then I started getting the emails of like, hey man, how do I get back in the fight? Like, where should I go and work in tech? What company is worth making this life transition for me and my family? Because I don't feel fulfilled. So I saw this wave of, just as the top kind of FANG style tech companies, they follow the top engineers and where they go and what companies they may or may not start or what companies they join. Operators are the same way. They are the engineers of national security technology. So where they select, assess, and choose to go, I was just paying attention to that migration, and I wanted to make sure that I could back the companies that truly proved to be breakout in the terms of NatSec as we need it.
And this is where Union enters the story.
It's one thing to raise as a solo kind of first-time fund manager, and then it's another thing to stumble across an idea that is so compelling. And then you go out to market and you try to seek out a founder who's building it. Because that's what we do in venture. I'm hunting people. I'm looking for an archetype. I hunt founders. I don't hunt companies. But I couldn't find a founder that was trying to build this particular business. And that business is Union. So when you don't find it, you have to build it. And I thought on it. I never intended to find a company while also raising the next fund for BVVC. But it happened. And now it's turning into something remarkable.
You can listen to Cogs of War again on your podcast app of choice. Don't miss it. Subscribe to it now. And now back to my conversation with Brad and Liza.
You asked why NVIDIA wants to do this. I mean, Americans, whether they be policymakers or tech CEOs, have always looked to the China market with a lot of hope, and they've always been willing to exchange kind of near-term concessions with the hope that later the market will open up in a way that's profitable for them. And so in this case, just a couple days after Jensen Huang visited the president in the Oval Office, he got on a plane and went to China and said, hey, I'm excited to sell you the H20, but I'm even more excited about selling you the next chip that I'll design. So a version of the Blackwell, which is their next generation chip that's even better than the Hopper that they're selling now. And so Jensen has his eye on the future China market. And so they seem to be operating on this assumption that not only will they be able to keep selling the H20, but they'll be able to sell this next generation chip that's even better than what they're selling now.
If you're a more normal guy like me, you're listening to this, you're like, this is just a lot of technical stuff. This doesn't really affect my life. Make the case to someone who has no technical background, but who cares a lot about national security, about why this matters to them. Give us the bottom line.
I'll make the case for the H20, which I said is an inference chip. They're best deployed on the edge. So when you think of what drones might be using in China, right, they'll be using an H20 inference chip, which is probably twice as good as any indigenous Chinese chip for the same purpose. You think about surveillance in Xinjiang or broad surveillance in Chinese society. These inference chips like the H20 are the ones that are preferred to do that. You think of these massive large language models. Part of the training, not all of the training, is relying on this inference to help develop synthetic data. So if you care about the AI race, or if you care about their military prowess or the police state in China, the inference chip like the H20 is the best in the world and enables them to do that.
Brad is right that it's critical to winning the AI race. And so which models do we want to be using? Large language models are battling it out in the world market. And in 3, 5, 10 years, do we all want to be stuck with using censored Chinese LLMs, or do we want American and other allied options? I think the former. But the other point is the national security point. And we know that the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, also has put in orders for these H20 chips. It was just revealed that they were looking to procure these chips for their robotic dogs that the PLA has, as well as AI data centers that the PLA runs to improve their weapon systems and all of that.
So an American company is being allowed to supply the Chinese military, is what you're telling me.
We know that China has a long track record of using American semiconductors to advance their military ambitions.
But when you say
These
orders
are inherently...
you said orders are in for the H20.
Yeah, the Business Insider just published a scoop about the PLA putting in these orders. They hadn't been placed. This was a couple months old, so it wasn't clear whether the chips had gone there. But I think a better case study that was in the headlines, it popped out recently after kind of being dormant for a few years, was the Cadence Design. This is an American company that designs tools to make semiconductors, to design semiconductors, EDA software for any wonks out there. And so it came out that they had been fined $140 million for criminal violations. They admitted to criminal violations of export violations. And this gets back to ancient history. Back in 2021, the Washington Post broke this story about this Cadence design software being used by the PLA in their hypersonic missile testing labs. So this is the PLA testing hypersonic missiles, which eventually could be used in a Taiwan contingency or something like that. And American technology was being used. So this was a violation of the controls at the time. Everyone forgot all about that because our memories are very short. And so I was kind of surprised when all of a sudden the news pops out about this fine from the DOJ.
It strikes me that there's a mirror image of this debate in China, and this gets to the mutual entanglement of our economies, which creates some challenges. So imagine you have some party guys sitting in a room in Beijing before this trade settlement that we just had with China. And they're saying, listen, we got this huge advantage in rare earths. And if we give them to the Americans, they're just going to pocket it and use it for their defense industry. And we've given them time to advance their own investment in rare earth mining and processing and production. And it just strikes me that the conversation we're having about chips is sort of the same conversation they're having about rare earths in closed rooms, not on podcasts for obvious reasons. And of course, I don't know this for a fact, but it strikes me that it seems like this was probably a consideration, at least in the trade negotiations, because it's not just about chips. It's about our own dependencies with China as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's so interesting, Ryan, is that the best I can tell with the H-20 concession, this was a unilateral U.S. concession. I don't think it was part of the deal. So this is something that hasn't been resolved yet. And there's a little bit of revisionist history happening right now that, somehow we got concessions from China on rare earths in exchange for that. But actually, the H-20 decision came much after the trade talks in London. So the point is, I think that this was a major U.S. concession, something concrete that the Chinese really wanted. And we haven't gotten anything other than, let's keep talking. So there's no confirmation of a trade deal with China. We don't have assurance that Beijing won't twist the knife again on rare earths. If the Chinese gave us that assurance, I'm not sure who would believe them, given their track record. So right now, this tool of rare earth export controls is still there on the shelf. And I think as soon as things go south again, the Chinese can twist the knife again whenever they want.
No, I think that's right. I mean, there's no obvious reason why they made this concession. It has been presumably part of larger talks. But I do think it is important for your listeners who care about national security to realize that there's a lot of technical jargon and specifications about these kind of chips. You can get lost in that. But as a simple matter, there are chips that you train a model on to create it, and then chips that are better for running the model. And the H-20 is the best chip in the world for running the model. So if you want the Chinese to have great models and then run them better and equivalent to US models and use them for C4ISR, intelligence fusion, there's a story in today's New York Times about a Chinese company called Galaxy, which is fusing all of your social media data with AI-generated visuals to do information operations. That's done by inference chips like what the H-20 provides, better than any chip in the world. So we're giving these chips to a country that uses them in ways that we find quite nefarious often, and it simply makes no sense.
So you came out with this big effort. What do you want to see Congress do?
Well, I'd like to see Congress step in and try to urge the president, or even if they can, prohibit the president from allowing the H-20s to go forward. And more broadly, to try to keep the export controls in place of all these chips. Because the H-20 is just one type of chip. There's new chips all the time coming online. They're very important. This is the U.S. comparative advantage. Right? We have the best chips in the world accessible to our AI labs, and we should keep that kind of limitation in place.
And this really cuts across partisan lines. There's Republicans that surely support what you're trying to do. There's also Democrats. There's also probably Democrats and Republicans that don't agree with you. And what kind of traction are you getting?
I don't find many people disagree with me about the merits for export controls. People might disagree about other aspects of AI policy. But when you say we need to keep U.S. advantage in these export controls, not many people disagree on that question. And so China hawks in both parties, but other people who just say, like, yeah, it makes sense for the U.S. to not be providing the Chinese People's Liberation Army, right, with chips that will only increase their warfighting capability.
Yeah. And again, I think there's this really kind of interesting, but ultimately specious argument that's being kind of developed in support of this decision. And that, again, is that we want to keep China addicted to our technology stack, that we want to keep Chinese developers using our technology so they don't develop alternatives. It's ultimately kind of a condescending argument to make about the CCP. For any student of their technology plans going back decades, their self-reliance drive, their indigenous innovation drive, to think that they have all of a sudden decided from scratch that they're going to start developing indigenous semiconductors. And this was kind of just a result of the first Trump administration or just a result of something the Americans did in the last few years, is just completely ignores the track record that for now they are reliant on U.S. advanced AI chips. They know that. It's causing them pain. The DeepSeek founder and others have admitted this. Chinese leaders, as Brad mentioned, have admitted this. For now, it causes pain. They've been doubling down on their self-reliance drive. We've seen them make progress in many other sectors. And now these advanced AI chips and the technology that makes them, the EUV lithography and others, are some of these small remaining choke points that are very narrow but incredibly important. And so if we just kind of unilaterally cede that to them, it's kind of like if you're in a street fight with a rival and you say, oh, well, you have muskets and I have automatic weapons, so I'm just going to sell you my automatic weapons so that at least you're using the best tech. Why wouldn't you just keep the automatic weapons for yourself? I mean, it just kind of defies logic and it defies an understanding of how the Chinese operate.
And just a subtle point to add to that. I mean, I could hear someone saying, well, they're going to develop their own indigenous capabilities. We might as well sell as much as we can to them now. And right, they're invariably going to develop their own domestic production. When it comes to semiconductors, there's adequate reason to believe they can never really match what the West is doing. I mean, this technology is so bespoke, so esoteric, so held in one or two companies in Austria, Holland, Korea, Japan. The supply chain is very narrow. And if the export controls are well prosecuted, you can keep them behind probably for years to come. And so their attempt to indigenize their production could well be stymied. And that's why we shouldn't just give them the technology, right? They may never get it if we don't just hand it over to them.
You're right, but they have to be kept in place, right? And so that's why this move is so lacks any sort of strategy.
Right.
I might just be asking you two to speculate here, but how do you think NVIDIA's American customers feel about this? Let's take OpenAI as an example, or heck, like Grok, like whatever. You are one of these companies, and you're of course reliant on NVIDIA because no one can really make what they make in the way that they do it. At least that's my understanding. But you're also seeing them sell to another major industrial technological powerhouse, which has its DeepSeek, which they're probably not thrilled about existing, using the same chips. Some smuggled, perhaps, some sold legitimately, I don't know. Maybe they're not speaking out about it, but how do you think they feel about it?
Well, we know there's a soaring demand for chips. And so if they're going to Chinese customers rather than American customers, I don't think they can be that happy.
And I'll just speculate as well. If you're Sam Altman, Dario Amodei at Anthropic, Elon at, say, Grok, or Demis Hassabis at Google DeepMind, which is the big U.S. labs, I think you fear one thing, which is that Chinese will develop models equal to your own and commoditize them. Like take DeepSeek, which is very good, open source. All of those guys are trying to create value at their level, right? At the fab level for their models. We have to pay for it. And they're having a lot of people pay for it, right? OpenAI announced they're going to do $19 billion annualized run rate this year. If that becomes a commoditized product, maybe the Chinese have an equal one, those labs lose their whole business proposition. And so I think that's a fear for them. They want to keep the value at the fab, at the lab.
Well, Meta is also trying to open source and commoditize.
No, Meta is also trying to commoditize it, right? That's why Meta and the other groups, right, are a bit at odds. It's like, where does the value, is it going to be in the application layer, or is it going to be at the lab level? And so those big leaders want it at the lab level.
Yeah, and even Meta is supposedly building this Manhattan-sized AI data center, right? I'm sure they'll need a few chips for that.
And they've said they may go closed source on that one as well, right? So it's simply about business for Meta. So we'll see where they stick to their open source policy going forward.
And you don't have to be ultimately so sympathetic with U.S. tech firms. I mean, they sometimes rightly get a beating in U.S. public opinion, for better or worse. But if you ask an ordinary American, which AI model do you want to be dependent on that's going to have access to your sensitive data and the ability to tunnel into your systems? I mean, would you rather be dependent on an American model that at least is subject to some kind of rule of law, some kind of transparency, or a Chinese model? I think ordinary Americans would say, I'll take an American model. Thank you very much.
Even a shitty American surveillance capitalist model, I guess, is better than a shitty Chinese surveillance capitalist model. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the War on the Rocks podcast. Please do not forget to check out our membership program at warontherocks.com/membership. Our prices are going up soon, so you're going to want to lock in that new price and become a member now.